Okay, welcome back to the second part of callbacks, the introduction to what callbacks are. And if you haven't seen the first one, I suggest you do that. We checked in on how you can pass functions as parameters, a little bit like this. So you can have a function up here that is defined here, and then we can call another function here where we accept that function as a parameter. Meaning that we can send the reference to the function here, and then if you want to get called back. So basically we're telling JavaScript that do whatever you need to do main and then call back on this method here. And that's exactly what it will do. So that's referred to as a callback. And we also said that this function could actually be inlined here if we wanted to. Yeah, that would work exactly the same. Because one thing that passing functions like this does not solve is a problem with the design of JavaScript, or problem, it's how JavaScript is designed. And here's how it works. JavaScript is single-threaded, meaning that once it runs a line, it will run that line whatever it does. So imagine for a while that main here did something before it called back here that took minutes to complete. Take a long time. For example, get something from a different URL or just wait for a while. If that happens, then everyone that is using this program needs to wait. That is really bad if this is in a browser, because it means that your browser over here will not accept clicks. You can't switch over to another tab or even close the browser. Imagine it's a little bit the same as happens when you do an alert box. So you will block the main thread. That is really bad in a browser, but it's disastrous on the back end, because it basically means that if this were a server, for example an Express server, and you were blocking the main thread for a long time here before you call back, then everyone that was calling this server has to wait for you. So if this takes only 2 seconds and we have 10 people before me, then I have to wait 20 seconds for my request to get served. That is unacceptable. And that's why JavaScript use callback functions to handle asynchronous functionality. So let's take a look at that. We're going to clear out that example. And again, as I said before, this is basically me just walking through this blog post. So we're going to check in a very famous method in JavaScript called set timeout. So let's do that. We're going to go over here. Set timeout, yeah, we can borrow that part as well. So set timeout is a little function that is actually built into JavaScript itself, or being built into Node. And it basically has these parameters. It has a callback function, then a timeout, and then any arguments that you want to pass to that function. Let's make a function called myfunc. I'm going to type it from there. So, and it takes some arguments, and once we call it, we will basically just log the information to the terminal. So it will basically just say that, and then yeah, I'm gonna do it inside here, just do that. So let's take out set timeout and then call myfunc, because right now it's just defined. So let's call it also and just say funky here. There we go. And if we want to run this now as it is, we can just do node in the node index.js. Boom. Nothing particularly strange there. Let's now do that, but do it on another thread. Do it as an asynchronous function. And we're going to do that by using this setTimeout function. As you can see, it has a handler or a callback, then a timeout, and then some arguments. So now what we can do is myfunc and a timeout and then some arguments. Let's pass it that. So these are the arguments that will be passed to myfunc. And now if we run this application, it will look like this. Nothing happens for about 1.5 seconds, and then all of a sudden the function runs. So what happened there really? Well, it was quite easy, to be honest. What happens is that we say, here's a reference to my func, and set timeout will keep that reference, and after 1.5 seconds it will call it, passing these parameters. And you now know from the last episode that if I just do this, it will be exactly the same thing. Save some formatting maybe. So let's see, I'm gonna run it like that actually. Takes 1.5 seconds and then it calls in there. So this is now an anonymous function. Or actually now it's an anonymous function where we don't have a name, but it's an inline function. So it will call this function after 1.5 seconds, passing funky as argument. And you also know that we can clean this up quite a lot by just doing this. So it gets a lot smaller. So let's do that while we're at it. So now we have the function on one line here, and then on the next line we're gonna do the timeout, and then on the last line we're gonna do the argument. So it looks like this. So basically we're telling set timeout, call this function after 1.5 seconds, passing it the argument funky as argument. And now we're basically using the asynchronous feature of set timeout. So this will actually run, the waiting will run on another thread. And we can test this out by demonstrating something that at first will look really strange, because we're going to do this now. Let's add a log statement here to call before. And if we run this, unsurprisingly, before gets printed, and then it takes 1.5 seconds, and then we get our little console log. But what happens now? I'm going to put this after. So if we do this, and we're going to call this after. Well, now you will be surprised, I think, because we get before and after, and then we get printout of the function that was called. Because this happens on another thread. So remember what I said, that JavaScript is single-threaded. So it will start here, then it will run this, which basically says to timeout, here's a function that I want you to call later. This is not calling the function, this is just defining that function that will be called later. So again, this is the same thing as doing this, const f equal that, and then pass f here. So now you understand that on line 3 here, f is declared, but it's never called. Here it's also just referred to, it's never called. And then 1.5 seconds later, JavaScript will call back into the main thread here. So that means that now we can pull this up on one line to make it a little bit more readable. But it means this. First, before will be printed. Then set timeout will be called, passing this reference. And then directly after that, after will be printed. And then 1.5 seconds later, set timeout has done its thing and will call back the f function, passing it funky as parameter. And this is exactly what we see when we call this function. Before and after gets printed, and then a while later the callback function f was called. So that is what callbacks is all about. But that is also quite boring of an example. Let's do something a little bit more advanced, and with a little bit I mean a lot more advanced. But don't worry, we will be able to understand this as well. Let's take something that you probably have seen before. Let's take this player's service. So imagine that we have a client here to get players from some kind of API. And if we want to call the player's client, it has a getPlayer method. That is awesome. We can pass it an ID. I'm going to pass it the ID of 1. And then a callback function. And now I'm going to pass it the reference to this function that I've written here, which is called print player. And this function, it expects a player object back. So we will get some data back here. And then we will print a stupid little log statement. And then we will log out the name of that player. And obviously now we can instead, if we wanted to, we can do this. We could copy this and just paste that in here. Take out that. Do this instead. This is just syntactical sugar to do exactly the same thing. So basically, here's a declaration of a function. You have done your work, let's call this function back. Meaning that once you have done whatever you need to do, please call this function, passing it some player data. And this player data should have a player name, otherwise this will break. So that's pretty easy to understand, but let's see how this is built then inside. So I'm going to go into this player's client object now. Don't be scared, it's a lot of code, but we'll walk through it very slowly and little by little. We're going to find the getPlayer method, and it's up here. I'm going to collapse this, otherwise you will just read that. So basically here what we're saying is that we get the ID, which was 1, and then we get some kind of callback function. So on line 4 we're constructing some kind of a URL here, concatenating the ID like that. And then we take that URL and call the get function that is defined down here, passing it the callback function on. So it will continue to pass it on just like you would pass on a string or anything, because functions are first-class citizens. You can pass them around as parameters. In this case, we are just passing it on to the next one. So remember, callback here now refers to this function that is declared here. Or if we wanted to write it shorter, we can use this function instead. That is a named function declared above. So it refers to this. So going into getPlayer means that callback will refer to that function that prints the player to the console. And we're passing it on to the get method. And the get method in turn uses JavaScript built in https.get that gets a URL, and then now you're starting to get the hang of it, because this is a function. What it's really saying here is that it is a function called res that takes a function that has no name with one parameter called res, and it goes all the way down here. This is the function. So what we're saying here is https.get. It has the following. Let's write it again, and maybe it gets clear. It takes some options here. In our case, we're just going to pass it a URL. The next parameter is a callback function that will receive an incoming message, the result that we're going to call res. So that's what this is all doing. Let's go back to what it said. So basically we're saying HTTPS, do whatever you need to do with this URL to get the result. And once you're done, call me back on this function, giving me the res variable with the result. Once we get in here, we're gonna set up a data object. And this is a little bit old school, but basically we're using callbacks again here, telling it, as long as you get data, call this function. And this function gets a chunk of data and basically just append it to the data object already. This is done if you would get more than one chunk of data. In our case, it's probably just one, but you never know. So this is how you do it with HTTPS. There are other libraries when you don't need to do this. It's known as data pumping. So as long as we get the data messages like this, we're going to take all the chunks and append it to the data. But once we get the end message, what are we going to do? Well, another callback function. Here's the definition of that callback function. And this callback function gets no parameters, but rather just a message. This is just a message. The result is now complete. It's ended. So we come here and we use JSON parse to parse all the data that we put together here. And from that we get some parsed data. And then finally we're going to call the callback function. And now we're reaching all the way out here. And the callback function was something that we passed into the get method up here. And if you remember, the callback function was actually something that got sent all the way into this getPlayer function. So it's actually something that we defined up here, the print player function. So what it says is call getPlayer with 1 and this print player function. Take that ID and construct a URL and pass the print player function to the get method. And in the get method, use HTTPS get with a URL. And once that gets its result back, call this function. So it's not calling this function directly here. This function is just defined here. We could have done this if we wanted to. Const handle result and then handle result. But if we did that, we would have problems because this function will internally need a callback function. So we're going to go back, but just to show you that once we write the function here, this is not calling the function. This is just writing the function. And in here we handle all the data pumping. We get a message of that the result is completed. And when we do that, we can safely JSON parse the data and call back to the print player function. So if all of that works, let's run it and see node. And now I'm going to run this file where we execute the get player function on the player's client. So that's called the player service in my case. Let's go. Now you will notice that this takes a little while because calling into an external API here actually takes some time. So therefore we don't want everyone that's calling this feature to wait for me, but rather get the result really, really fast. So now we're waiting for our result, and finally we got back Luke Skywalker. So let's test this. If we do, we're gonna take this function here. I'm not doing a curl, I'm doing it here. Passing it to 1. It will take some time, but we get Luke Skywalker. Let's be crazy and pass a 2 here. Now we should get some, yeah, we got CP30. So that's another character of the Star Wars universe. So this is how callbacks functions are used throughout all of the JavaScript that you will see. And the reason for that is that otherwise we will be blocking the main thread all along. Now we can do other things in here. So again, I want to show you, this is the console log before, and then we're going to do a console log after as well, after. And now as you will remember, we get before and after right after each other, because this will happen not on the main thread. This request, or rather calling this function, will happen once all of this code in here has executed. And that will take, not forever, but still long enough that we don't want to do it on the main thread. So this is what callbacks are used for. And as you can see, they can get pretty long winding where you would nest callbacks into each other like this and pass the outermost callback all the way down, so that we here on line 14 can call back to the thing that actually needs the data. So imagine us writing this in one big expression. We would get a lot of these at the end, a lot of functions nested inside each other. This is what is known as callback hell. So I'm going to walk through this one more time, because I know that this is a little bit tricky to understand. But basically here we're declaring a function that we want to use in order to print the player name. We are not calling the function, we're just declaring it. And here on line 9, we're telling the get player data to get player 3, and once it's get player function to get player 3, and once it's done, call this function that is declared up here. So once that's done, you will call into here. The get player function is defined over here. It takes this ID, which is set to 3 now, and the callback function, which is the player function, and it constructs a URL and then call the get function that we have down here, passing on the print player function. In here we're using the built-in HTTPS module, and that's get method, and it in turn has a callback function that gets the result. This is just the declaration of it, it's not the execution of it. So once the URL here, once the get method has got some data, it will call this function. And inside here, we have yet another callback function that tells us every time you get data, call this function. Once you get the end signal, call this function. So there's callbacks up and callbacks. But in here, once we get all the data, once we have all the data, we're going to JSON parse it and then finally call back to the callback function that was passed in here, which in turn was passed in here, which in turn came as a parameter here, which in turn was the one that we passed in here, which is declared up here. So running this code now will not block the main thread. That's why we get the before and then directly after that the after, but it will return the data and we'll get our favorite robot R2D2 back. So hopefully you could follow along there. If not, all of this code and all of this is written in this blog post over here, and you can type along yourself in your tempo. I hope this made it clear. Thank you for listening.